Now, coming up, we've got a couple of articles about the shootings, and that all ties in really to gun control. And we're going to show you in the second article just how that ties in. The first one, however, says confirmed the Batman shooter, James Holmes, was on psychotropic drugs. Yes, yet another mass killer on violence-causing antidepressants. Newly released court documents confirm that Batman shooter James Holmes was taking the antidepressant drug Zoloft before he conducted his massacre in an Aurora theater last year, underscoring yet again the prevalent yet underreported connection between psychotropic drugs and mass shootings. And while it was known that the prescription medication was seized during a search of his property, it's just now that we're realizing that the prescription medication that they found was sertraline, a generic version of Zoloft. Now, Zoloft is the same psychotropic drug, as the article mentions, that Columbine killer Eric Harris was taking before his rampage. It has also been connected to more than 1,000 suicides and hundreds of episodes of manic aggression, mania and aggression, I should say. And Lou Rockwell writes, how much longer are we going to find scapegoats among innocent gun owners and video games and not look at the real thing that connects all of these incidents, the underlying substance that's there, and that is these psychotropic SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That is the common thread, not some particular gun, not some particular kind of ammunition, or the number of magazine, the size of the magazine clip. None of that is the common thread. The common thread is the drugs, and yet these are drugs that are approved by the FDA. These are drugs that most of the television industry depends on for the majority, or at least a large chunk of its revenue. You can't watch television without seeing one pharmaceutical ad after the other, and they are not about to criticize this and look at what is really behind these shootings. But even if you don't believe that James Holmes was the shooter, and many of us are suspicious that perhaps maybe he wasn't, maybe he was just this patsy that showed up there. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. Still, Zoloft could be very useful in controlling a patsy, for example. Now, this next article, The Problems with Sandy Hook Elementary Massacre, actually looks at the Sandy Hook Elementary Massacre, and he does something that's a little bit dangerous. He not only points out the contradictions and anomalies, but he also suggests exactly how he thinks it happened. Now, this is a huge article. It's about 43 pages, but it is well worth a read. And this is what Andrew S. McGregor of therebel.org says. He says, the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, the FBI, and the BATF were all involved in the planning of the moves to bring about the required changes once the State Department had initiated moves with the UN, and that is to ban guns. And he says the modus operandi was to follow the successful moves orchestrated by the National Coalition for Gun Control, led by Rebecca Peters in Australia and Philip Alpers in New Zealand in the late 1980s up to 96. The preliminary moves, he believes, were made in July of 2012. The American State Department under Hillary Clinton was in discussions with the UN in regards to an arms trade treaty. And if you recall, just before that happened, they had as that was coming up, a week before it was to go to a vote, that was when they had the Aurora shootings initially. And then he says the plan required a double whammy, a second and more heart-wrenching massacre, so as the Obama administration could say that it had the required changes to the Constitution been permitted back in July 2012, then this kind of massacre, like Sandy Hook, would never have taken place. Well, I believe that this narrative has been crafted, as he says, for quite some time. There's evidence going all the way back to 2009 that one of the first things that Obama did was to start to try to constrain the supply of ammunition. And one of the ways that he did that was to initially say that they were not going to recycle brass that the military had used, once used brass, into the private sector. And now we see that it's gone full circle, and they're even using the Department of Homeland Security to try to dry up sources of ammunition. But there was another key component to that, and that was Fast and Furious. Fast and Furious was all about the transfer of arms across borders. And they wanted to make sure that people were scared about that. And the follow-up, the piece of legislation that was going to follow up on that was the UN Arms Trade Treaty, which, surprise, is about not allowing small arms and ammunition to cross borders. But as we know, as CBS News and other mainstream media have even reported, Fast and Furious was a false flag operation. And in my opinion, the first shooting was an effort to try to pull that back. They had lost that narrative. They were being attacked by the Republicans on partisan grounds because the Republicans also have been involved in these same types of operations. But they were being attacked on partisan grounds for political gain just before the election. And they had the Aurora shooting 1 week before the UN Arms Trade Treaty was supposed to take place. And what they said they were going to do was delay that again until the after the American election. Well, it was on the very day of the election that the UN met. They met the same day we had our election and said, we're going to get back to this in March. And now it's March, it's actually past March, and what they did was they passed it. And we see a struggle going on in the Senate with Rand Paul and others who are trying to fight this. And yet we see Obama with his extra constitutional, non-legislative means trying to enact gun control. But I want to get back to this article. And this is the kind of information that this guy digs up. It's really worth your while to read this. Now listen to this quote. He says, this abrupt ending, now this is just going through the narrative of the story. He goes in and talks about from the very beginning, he lays this background as we just talked about here, but then he also talks about the very specific contradictions of what happened, because if you remember, there were several stories that kept resurfacing the first day. We had video clips that contradicted official stories. I'm going to pick this up just a little ways through the shooting, and he says, this abrupt ending of the massacre is extremely telling. It tells us that the gunman was able to listen in on the police communications and learned that the report to 911 had occurred as expected. However, the report was of, quote, shots being fired, unquote, not of children being murdered. So the emergency dispatcher, instead of calling for the emergency response team at Carmel, or that would be the SWAT team, simply gave the call to local police who were able to respond so quickly that they almost caught the fleeing gunman. And as it was, the gunman had 45 seconds to finish the shooting, leave the school building, get into the waiting escape vehicle, which was a red-maroon van, registration number 872YEO, which the first police responders saw leaving the school and requested details. That just gives you an idea of the kind of detail that he goes into here in examining these contradictions. It's well worth your time to look at that. Even if you don't agree with his conclusions, you need to look at these contradictions and anomalies and think about what's going on here and how it just fit perfectly in the overarching scheme and timing of all these other things that were happening. It looks very orchestrated from the larger view down to the lower view. We've got an article here from Paul Craig Roberts talking about the assault on gold. And he says, for Americans, financial and economic Armageddon. Oh, watch out, because that's the word that they used, the Hawken family used, and they accuse them of being a death cult. But he says, for Americans, financial and economic Armageddon might be close at hand. The evidence for this conclusion is a concerted effort by the Federal Reserve and its dependent financial institutions to scare people away from gold and silver by driving down their prices. He says the Federal Reserve used its independent banks too big to fail to short the precious metal markets, and by selling naked shorts in the paper bullion market against the rising demand for physical possession, the Federal Reserve was able to drive the price of gold down to $1,750 and to keep it more or less capped there until recently, when a concerted effort on April the 2nd through the 3rd, 2013, just a couple of days ago, drove gold down to $1,557 and silver, which had approached $50 per ounce in 2011, down to $27. And he points out in this context that the Fed is printing $1 trillion in paper currency a year. This is why people are going to gold, and this is why, even with the illegal manipulation of the market by the Federal Reserve, gold is still a good investment, because eventually this paper money that the Fed is printing at the rate of $1 trillion a year, the same thing is going to happen to it that once happened to paper money at the time of the American Revolution. They had a phrase, not worth a continental, because that is exactly what they did at the time of the American Revolution. As they got their independence, they started printing money during the war, and it was absolutely worthless. And the founders had a memory of that, just as Germans have a memory of the Weimar Republic. That's a much more recent memory. And they're very concerned about just printing paper currency without any restraints. But Americans have lost that memory. And we are going to see that it is not gold, which is looking kind of bubbly, and that's what the Fed said. You'll see that in this article. It is not gold that's looking bubbly. It is paper currency from the Federal Reserve. Now, we got a clip here from Jeremy Irons. We don't necessarily have to have celebrities endorse the truth, but it's always interesting to see a familiar face, and especially even someone from England, point out the faults of the nanny state. Here's that clip.
Are you a proud smoker, and are you a libertarian when it comes to these sorts of civil things?
I'm a complete libertarian. I think it's very, very dangerous, and I really mean that. I think the smoking ban is the tip of an iceberg of society, the leaders of society telling us how to be. I think it is not their business, but it's the tip of the iceberg because it's an attitude. It's an attitude where the governors think, we know what's best for people, and they're so stupid they will only not do it if we ban it.
Bloomberg's nanny state is a laughing stock of the world, and Jeremy Irons nailed it just right. But you know, it's not really any difference in principle between telling people what size drink they can have or if they can smoke a cigarette and telling them that they can't smoke marijuana, or sending them to jail for a mandatory minimum of 10 years because of a certain amount of marijuana they possess, or, as we saw yesterday, taking the children away from a family because they possess a small amount of marijuana. In principle, these things are all the same. We laugh at Bloomberg's nanny government, but a lot of the same people who laugh at Bloomberg will accept the idea of drug prohibition. They don't see that they're fundamentally the same. You know, they've been very successful in breaking us into two camps, into this left-right paradigm, into two different cultures. One culture sees that there is a difference between, that it's very dangerous to have gun control, but then they embrace drug prohibition. The other group says, well, I want gun prohibition, but I don't think drugs should be prohibited. Neither of these two groups really see the underlying freedom principle that's involved here. It's a very dangerous thing. And it's not just destroying the lives of people who engage in this activity, like the Haken family. It is also destroying our economy. It is destroying our system of government. It is destroying our personal freedoms of even the people who don't use these prohibited substances. That's what's behind the war of prohibition, the war, as I call it, the war of drugs. Because it's not a war on drugs. It is a war of drugs. They're using drugs as a weapon against us, against our economy, against our Constitution and our freedoms. And we've got someone coming up after the break I don't want you to miss. His name is Jim Gierach. He's with Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. This is a man who was for 43 years a prosecutor. And he saw, he was a prosecutor before drug prohibition started, before Nixon started his war on drugs. And he saw that come in. He saw Reagan go in with his mandatory minimums and his zero tolerance and his building prisons everywhere. And he saw that none of this worked. And he saw the damage being done to society, the absurdity of this, the failure of this. And he's going to tell us, as a former prosecutor, how ridiculous this is. We're going to talk about that right after the break. Stay tuned.
Jakari Jackson here, and I want to talk to you for a second about water. You know about ProPure, our flagship water purification system, but check out some of our portable water filter products at InfoWarsStore.com. The clearly filtered water pitcher. Also, for those of you on the go, we have the Athlete Edition filtered water bottle and the RAD Eliminator Pro filtered sports bottle that removes radiation. And keep in mind, we have replacement filters for all of these products. The ever-popular grab-and-go bag favorite, the Life Straw, the Crystal Quest shower filter system, and the Aquapod kit, great for mass storage of water. And while you're at the InfoWars shop, pick up a copy of our latest book, 31 Days to Survival. You can find all this and more at the InfoWarsStore.com, and don't forget it's your support that funds our operation. Sign up for our free newsletter at InfoWars.com/newsletter.